There are experiments, and then there are experiments. The kind that make you sit back and wonder why someone did that in the first place. From pharaohs isolating infants in the name of linguistics to scientists dosing elephants with enough LSD to flatten a football team, history is full of moments where the pursuit of knowledge veered sharply into the really absurd. Some were misguided, some were grotesque, a few were weirdly ahead of their time, but all of them, every last bizarre, rule-breaking, eyebrow-raising entry, share one thing in common. They really happened. This isn't about scientific breakthroughs or tidy textbook milestones. It's about the messy, ethically dubious, and occasionally nauseating detours that brought us there. We're going to dive into the weirdest experiments ever recorded, moments that range from tragic to comical and just about everything in between. Let's get into it! Okay, let's start things off with one of the oldest psychological experiments that was ever recorded, and easily one of the weirdest. Back in ancient Egypt, Pharaoh Psammetichus I, this is back in the 7th century BC, he allegedly decided that he wanted to discover the world's original language. And because simply asking someone wasn't on the table, he did what any completely rational person would do. He ordered an experiment involving 2 newborn babies and absolute silence. There was to be no talking, no cooing, no contact with speech of any kind. If the babies eventually started speaking, Psammetichus reasoned, or whatever came out of their mouths must be the language humanity was born to speak. So, how did this royal experiment play out? Well, the infants were entrusted to a shepherd with strict instructions: provide for their every need, but never, ever speak a word in their presence. Just maintain absolute silence. And so the poor young'uns grew up in a quiet country cottage, hearing only the sounds of nature and their own babbling. The pharaoh waited 2 long years, eager for the moment when the children might finally utter something that could be identified as a real word. Soon enough, the big moment came. As Herodotus, a 5th century Greek historian who produced the oldest surviving account, tells it, one day the isolated toddlers ran up to the shepherd, reaching out and crying, "Bekos!" The baffled shepherd reported the strange word to Psammetichus. The pharaoh then consulted his scholars and learned that bekos is the Phrygian word for bread. Phrygia, if you happen to be wondering, was an ancient kingdom in what is now Turkey, notably not Egypt. From this, Psammetichus triumphantly concluded that the Phrygians must be an older civilization than the Egyptians, since in his mind the children's first spontaneous word was Phrygian. In other words, he thought it proven that Phrygian was the original language of humankind. Bit of a leap, wasn't it? And we, and basically every modern scholar, suspect the truth might be closer to the babies just making random sounds and an overeager pharaoh hearing what he wanted to hear. Still, you got to give the pharaoh credit for one of history's first recorded psychology experiments, albeit one so unethical that such isolation experiments, called language deprivation experiments in proper psychologies, are also dubbed forbidden experiments by the late Roger Shattuck, an American literary scholar. Tragically, too, the one conducted by Psammetichus was not the only such experiment conducted throughout history. History's really long and people are really fucked up. Fast forward to the 13th century, for example, and Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, with a markedly easier to pronounce name, supposedly attempted a similar mute upbringing experiment. According to a monk chronicler, Frederick's no-talk nursery ended in tragedy. Quote, "He labored in vain, for the children could not live without gladness of countenance and blandishments." Okay, don't know what that means, but in more plain terms, the babies died from the lack of love and human interaction. The key takeaway of it all, very, very little, besides a confirmation of the fact that, in what will no doubt come as a shock to nobody, it kind of turns out that depriving kids of one of their senses is neither a learned nor an ethical thing to do. Who would have thought? For our next delightful chapter, we head to Philadelphia in the early 1800s, where a young medical student named Stubbins Firth took hands-on research to a stomach-churning extreme. If you've never heard of Firth, you aren't alone, as he's something of a footnote in medical history, one most notable for his theory that yellow fever was not contagious and was instead caused by heat, which he initially evidenced by the fact that cases reliably dropped every winter. And it was in his trying to further evidence this theory that his peculiar experiment came about, one that, as the chapter title rather gives away, saw him chug vomit, specifically that of his infected patients. Bro. It was a simple enough idea, really. Expose yourself to the bodily fluids of yellow fever victims and see if you get yellow fever. It just happened that in his admittedly not incorrect assertion that a damn good way to ensure you were properly exposed was to ingest it. It was an approach which was nothing if not betting all on black. Drink it and don't get sick, and onto him would come all that sweet, sweet vindication that a man could ever want. Drink it and do get sick, and, well, it was yellow fever time, wasn't it? Which, with symptoms including fever, headache, muscle pains, nausea, vomiting, jaundice, and bleeding from basically every orifice, would likely not prove to be a joyous occasion. The experiment began in either 1802 or 1803. It depends on which source you consult. And actually, as much as history remembered it as the vomit-drinking experiment, he actually didn't go full hog right out of the gate, with him instead starting with animal tests. And how'd you get those animals to drink that sick? Ugh. And eventually escalating to using himself as a guinea pig once results proved unclear. And similarly, neither did he go straight to downing the gungy goodness when he opted to experiment on himself, instead beginning by slicing his arm open with his handy-dandy scalpel and then rubbing the vomit into his wounds. Again, bro, why? And, well, that did absolutely nothing. I mean, other than being disgusting, dude. He remained as fit as any man was able to in those days, and so he took it up a notch. He then dribbled the vomit into his eyes. Why? Now, thoroughly convinced that his yellow fever isn't contagious idea actually was bang on the money, he reasoned it was time to go all in, and so down the hatch it went. And just to be really sure he was getting full exposure, he also fried some vomit up in a pan so that he could breathe in the produced vapor. This is horrible. I can smell it. Amazingly, however, after repeated downings, he remained absolutely fine. Vindication, he was convinced, was his. And so he published his results in an 1804 paper titled A Treatise on Malignant Fever, with an attempt to prove its non-contagious, non-malignant nature. For a while, too, his findings remained medical canon, and, well, why wouldn't they? Sure, it's easy to laugh or to mock the sheer absurdity of the experiment. It is indeed. But by all the available evidence, Firth's theory checked out. Today, however, we know that he was just a little bit off the mark, to the same extent as a target shooter who takes a prone shot and somehow manages to pop themselves in the back of the skull. As it turns out, it actually has been since discovered that yellow fever is spread via bites from infected mosquitoes. Eating all that sick for nothing, mate. Oh, and it turns out that, as discovered by another medical researcher, Paul Smaglick, when producing a 2003 paper titled It Could Be Worse, Firth had drunk vomit from late-stage patients who were no longer infectious and just fighting off remaining symptoms. So even if his theory had actually been correct, his experiments wouldn't have proven it anyway. Looking back, we can chuckle and shudder at Firth's approach. It reads like a macabre comedy, part medical research, part dare gone wrong. Sounds like something they would do on Jackass. They probably have, right? But for all its shock value, this experiment had a sympathetic aim to show that caring for yellow fever patients was safe, so they wouldn't be abandoned. Of course, doing that by marinating in vomit was an unorthodox strategy, but still, you gotta respect his aims. All right, now we leap forward to the 1920s for a tale that sounds like a pulp sci-fi plot. A Soviet scientist's quest to create a human-ape hybrid.
To suggest that we can learn anything about the simian nature from a study of man is sheer nonsense.
Because why not? This isn't the premise of a bad B-movie. It was a real project by biologist Ilya Ivanov, who was essentially hell-bent on breeding a half-human, half-chimpanzee. Why? Well, depending on who you ask, it was a mix of scientific curiosity, ideological zeal, all right, and perhaps a dash of megalomania. This was the era of the young Soviet Union, you see, and its leadership was eager to flex their science muscles to both vindicate Marxist ideology and disprove creationism. I mean, noble goals there on the creationism thing, but make it a monkey hybrid, dude? Ivanov, therefore, saw an opportunity, and in 1926, he pitched the Soviet Academy of Sciences on a bold idea. Cross a human with a chimpanzee to prove Darwin right. Bro has misunderstood evolution and strike a blow against religious belief. If humans and apes could interbreed, it would underscore our common ancestry, a direct challenge to the biblical idea of human specialness. The Bolshevik government, seeking any propaganda win in the religion versus science debate, gave Ivanov the green light and the funding for his audacious experiment. This is so weird. How's this going to work? Ivanov, however, was no crackpot outsider like you might be thinking. Indeed I was. He was actually a renowned pioneer in artificial insemination of animals. By 1910, for example, he had already successfully made weird hybrids like zebra donkeys and bison cow crosses. As far as he was concerned, a human-ape hybrid was just the next logical step, and to be fair, in that context, you can kind of see why he might think so. Therefore, with Soviet backing, he set out to make the mythical human-Z a reality. He began by traveling to French Guinea in West Africa, where he would have access to chimpanzees in a research station. His initial plan was simple: inseminate female chimpanzees with human sperm and see if any became pregnant. He performed this procedure on at least 3 female chimps, eventually trying to father an ape-human baby with unwitting human donors as the father. Unsurprisingly, none of the chimps became pregnant, and nature, it seemed, wasn't so easily bent to Soviet will. Undeterred by his initial failure, however, Ivanov drafted a new plan, which was even more ethically fraught. If chimp mums wouldn't bear a half-human, maybe a human mother could bear a half-chimp. No, this is so wrong. And so he returned to the Soviet Union in 1929 with that in mind. According to some accounts, Ivanov initially hoped to do this without the woman's knowledge, a really rather horrifying notion. Finding that there was some moral lines that even the Soviet Union wasn't willing to cross, however, he then sought volunteers. Shockingly, a few women reportedly did volunteer, but before they could be inseminated, Ivanov's last suitable ape, a male orangutan, died of a brain hemorrhage, fate intervening just in time. By the early 1930s, when fresh apes had been sourced, Ivanov's project had lost support. Just thinking about those people who volunteered for that, what's up with you? Holy shit, you got issues. The scientific community in Russia was increasingly uncomfortable with the whole endeavor, and political winds shifted. Then, in 1930, Ivanov was abruptly arrested during a broader crackdown on scientists, and he ended up exiled to Kazakhstan, where he died in 1932, his human-ape hybrid quest left unfinished. Anyway, newspapers later sensationalized the effort as Comrade Stalin's attempt to make an ape-man super-soldier army, though historians note that Stalin himself wasn't specifically pursuing that fantasy. The truth seems to be that Ivanov had his own blend of motives, part genuine scientific inquiry, how closely are we related to apes, can a hybrid even form, and part ideological showmanship for the atheist Soviet agenda. Either way, the ethical line he crossed was massive. Even in the wild 1920s, many scientists worldwide were aghast at the thought of breeding humans with animals. It was the stuff of nightmares and outright blasphemy to some. Yes, but he doesn't have to be concerned about blasphemy, does he? He's trying to prove that atheism is better. The Soviet authorities, for their part, quietly shelved the project once it became a bit of an embarrassment. Documents about Ivanov's experiments only later came to light decades later, revealing just how far he went. And while Ivanov's attempt ended in failure, it remains one of the most jaw-dropping, what-were-they-thinking moments in scientific history. To this day, the idea of a human-chimp hybrid makes us instinctively recoil. It touches on deep fears and ethics. Kind of like eating sick. Ivanov boldly stepped into that taboo territory with a syringe in hand. And in doing so, he secured eternal notoriety as the scientist who tried to play Dr. Moreau in real life. If you thought the ape-human hybrid idea was a little bit monstrous, wait until you meet the dog with 2 heads, which was the result of an experiment also undertaken in the Soviet Union, but this time in the 1950s. It was the brainchild of Dr. Vladimir Demikov, an organ transplant pioneer and a man whose ideas of dogged determination we can only marvel at. Pun oh so intended. Demikov's goal wasn't to create a freak show for its own sake, however. He was actually trying to perfect organ transplantation techniques. But in the process, he ended up producing some of the most nightmarish images in medical history. Dogs with extra heads grafted onto their bodies. Over the course of about 20 years, Demikov created at least 20 two-headed animals, mostly dogs, methodically refining his surgical methods. It sounds like mad science, and it looked like mad science, but it actually did help to lay the groundwork for transplant surgery in humans down the line. So, you might be wondering, how do you make a two-headed dog? Well, Demikov's approach was to transplant the upper part of one dog, usually a small puppy, including its head, neck, and front legs, onto the body of a larger dog. Essentially, the big dog kept its own head and body, but now had a second smaller head and shoulders attached to its neck or shoulder regions. So weird what you guys doing? What are you up to, Soviet Union? The transplanted head wasn't just decorative, it was plumbed into the big dog's blood circulation. The decorative extra head. Demikov painstakingly connected arteries and veins so that the donor head shared the host's blood supply. He didn't bother connecting the spinal cord, which was beyond the technology of the time, so the second head couldn't control the host body. But the detached head itself was alive. It could blink, yelp, and move its ears and mouth. In one macabre photo in particular, the little puppy head can be seen lapping up some milk, which then dribbles out of its severed esophagus. Why? Why are you doing this? One of Demikov's most famous creations, however, was a two-headed dog composed of a German shepherd, the host, and a smaller dog grafted onto it. The big dog was named Pirat, and the little one, Shavka. Why are you naming them? Why is this so weird? According to reports, Pirat, with his extra head, survived for 29 or 30 days, an impressive run, all things considered. During that month, observers noted incredible details. Both heads were alert and could function somewhat independently. The host dog, Pirat, would sometimes be confused, shaking his shoulders when the attached pup's head bit his ear playfully, but he never attacked the extra head. The puppy head would sleep and wake on different cycles than the main dog head, as if it had its own little doggy brain schedule. This proved that the transplanted head wasn't just a vegetative appendage, it was conscious in its own right, if only to the limited extent that a decapitated dog head can be. In a perverse way, that was a breakthrough. It showed that complex surgery could keep a severed head alive by hooking it into another body's circulation. Of course, all of Demikov's two-headed dogs eventually died. They usually did that within days. The causes were often immune rejection or surgical complications, problems that transplantation science had to solve for future success. News of these experiments leaked out around 1959, shocking the world. Some American scientists even traveled behind the Iron Curtain to observe Demikov's techniques in the early 1960s, and pioneers like heart surgeon Christian Barnard, who later performed the first successful human heart transplant, later credited Demikov as an inspiration, calling him the father of heart and lung transplantation. From a modern perspective, Demikov's work raises big ethical red flags. Animal welfare was definitely compromised, to put it mildly, in the quest for medical progress. But at the time, the Cold War climate cast these experiments almost like a morbid competition, Soviet science displaying feats that seemed like pure sci-fi. And as weird as the two-headed dog experiments were, it did have a method to its madness. Demikov wasn't trying to create a new species or a carnival attraction. He wanted to test surgical reconnection of vital vessels and see how much of a body could be supported by a single heart. In one sense, he succeeded. Those attached heads lived, however briefly. His work ultimately paved the way for advances in transplant surgery, though one could argue it came at a high moral cost. Was it a cost that was worth it? Well, we're not the moral arbiters of that, so we'll let you decide. Our final experiment today takes a gigantic subject, a 7,000-pound elephant, and doses it with an absolutely terrifying amount of LSD. It happened during the 1960s, because LSD. Of course it did. It was, after all, an era when scientists were testing psychedelic drugs on all sorts of unwitting creatures, sometimes people, and even more people were willingly testing it on themselves. For science. But even in that anything-goes climate, the case of Tusko the elephant stands out as spectacularly ill-advised. It occurred in August 1962, specifically at the Oklahoma City Zoo, when a team led by Dr. Lewis West decided to see what would happen if you gave an elephant LSD. Now you might be asking, why, Simon? Why did he do this? Well, ostensibly, they wanted to investigate a phenomenon called musk, a periodic, aggressive, hormonal state in male elephants, and they wondered if LSD could trigger it. Therefore, on one fine morning, they shot Tusko, a male Asian elephant, with a syringe containing 297 milligrams of LSD. And you might be wondering, well, how much is that, Simon? I'll tell you. It's 3,000 times a typical human recreational dose. To put that in perspective, this was an enormous amount, even accounting for Tusko's weight. The result was immediate, and it was not pretty. Within 5 minutes, the shocked elephant trumpeted loudly, collapsed onto his side, defecated uncontrollably, and began trembling and seizing. His eyes rolled back, his legs stiffened, and he bit his own tongue. In short, Tusko went from calm to a full-blown elephantine nightmare trip in moments. Panicking, the team tried to calm Tusko down. About 20 minutes after the LSD injection, they administered a heavy dose of Thorazine, an antipsychotic medication, to sedate him, because if one gigantic dose of a mind-altering drug wasn't enough, let's just bang in a truckload of another one, shall we? Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, This made things worse. Thorazine could cause blood pressure to tank, and combined with LSD's effects, it was a recipe for disaster. Tusko's condition did not improve, and so in another hour they gave him a tranquilizer as well for good measure. But by that point, the poor elephant was already in dire straits. About an hour and 40 minutes after the experiment began, Tusko was dead. It doesn't take a vet to conclude that this was a horrible idea. The autopsy and later analysis suggested that if LSD alone hadn't killed Tusko, the cocktail of thorazine and other sedatives certainly did. The researchers had effectively sent the elephant into pharmacological shock. In the aftermath, Dr. West and his colleagues published a paper documenting the experiment and included one of the greatest understatements in scientific literature ever. It appears that the elephant is highly sensitive to the effects of LSD. Massive quantities of it. And well, no kidding, Tusko's sensitivity was such that he became the first and hopefully last elephant to die from an acid overdose, at least as far as we know. The scientific community and the public were rightly quite outraged and baffled by this. Was this knowledge worth the life of a rare, beloved animal? Well, in this one, we can pass moral judgment. No, it wasn't. Interestingly, in 1984, a different researcher, Ronald Siegel, attempted a sort of Tusko redemption experiment. He gave 2 elephants much smaller doses of LSD and, crucially, no thorazine. Those elephants survived just fine, showing mild effects, which suggests that it might have been the combination of drugs that was lethal, not the LSD alone. But by then the damage was done. Many have speculated on his motivations, given how utterly bizarre the experiment appears. Some note his tangential connection to the CIA's MK-Ultra program, which was covertly dosing people with LSD in the 50s and 60s, hinting this elephant experiment might have had shadowy funding or purpose. Others think it was just plain scientific curiosity taken to a dangerous extreme. Whatever the ultimate reason, the image of one of Earth's largest land animals being chemically blasted into oblivion is a haunting one. And for all that, what exactly did they actually learn? Well, the formal conclusion was that LSD did not, in fact, induce musk. It just induced agony. Not a surprise there. If there's any positive legacy here, it's that this fiasco likely deterred others from such extreme experiments on elephants. And, well, that's about it. Not really worth it, was it, guys? Thanks for watching.